My name is Madison Lane. I am 35 years old. And 22 months ago, I loaded everything I owned into a rented moving truck, drove 1,400 miles from Greenville, South Carolina to Denver, Colorado and never looked back. I didn't leave a note. I didn't make a phone call. I didn't send a single text to warn anyone. I just left. And here's the part that should shock you. Not one member of my family noticed I was gone for nearly 2 months. Not my mother. Not my brother. Not my sister-in-law. Nobody. The same people I had cooked for, cleaned for, scheduled for, driven around, and poured every spare hour of my life into for over a decade didn't notice I had vanished until they needed something from me. And when they finally did notice, they didn't call to ask if I was safe. They didn't call to ask where I was. They called because they needed a favor. That's when I decided to send the package. And that package didn't just change my life. It detonated theirs. Before I go any further, if you're new here and this story is already hitting close to home, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Stories like this one go up regularly and trust me, you don't want to miss where this one goes. Now let me take you back. Not to the day I left, but to the day it all started. Because it never starts with one big moment. Starts with something small. Something so quiet you almost miss it. For me, it started on a Saturday afternoon when I was 11 years old, standing in the kitchen of our house on Meridian Drive in Greenville, South Carolina, holding a dish towel I didn't know how to use yet. My father had walked out on us 3 months before. No warning, no explanation that made any sense to an 11-year-old. He was just there one morning and gone by evening. My mother, Regina Lane, took to her bedroom the way some people take to the ocean, completely and without looking back. She wasn't cruel about it. She wasn't screaming or throwing things. She was just absent. Present in body, gone in every way that mattered. She'd come downstairs for coffee, sometimes for dinner, and then disappear again behind a closed door and a television she kept on so loud you could hear it from the driveway. My brother Caleb was 8. He was small for his age and terrified of everything that year. The dark, loud noises, being alone in a room. He'd follow me from room to room like a shadow and I let him because I understood. I was scared too. I was just too busy to show it. That Saturday I had found half a pack of ground beef in the fridge, a can of diced tomatoes and some pasta. I'd never made anything more complicated than a bowl of cereal on my own before. But Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table with his chin in his hands and his eyes glassy and empty. And I knew without him saying a word that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. So I figured it out. I read the back of the tomato can. I guessed at the proportions. I burned the first batch a little, started over, and eventually produced something that looked close enough to a pasta sauce that Caleb ate 2 bowls of it without complaint. When I brought a plate upstairs and knocked on my mother's door, she opened it, took the plate, looked at it and said, "Finally." I was starving. Not "thank you." Not "are you okay?" Not "I'm sorry you're the one who had to do this." Just finally. I was starving. I stood in that hallway for a moment with my hand still raised from knocking and something shifted in me. Something I didn't have the vocabulary for at 11 but understood completely by the time I was 30. I had just become the person this family ran on. And once you become that person, no one ever lets you stop. Fast forward 23 years. I'm 34 years old, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Greenville, 15 minutes from my mother's house. I work as an operations coordinator for a regional logistics company. I'm good at my job, precise, dependable, the kind of person who catches problems before anyone else sees them coming. My boss, Terry, once told me I could manage a small country if I wanted to. What he didn't know is that I was already managing one. He just didn't pay. I kept a planner. Not a digital one. A physical one, the kind with tabs and color-coded stickers. I used it to track my work schedule and my family's lives simultaneously. Monday evenings, I drove my mother to her standing nail appointment because she'd decided 3 years ago that she wasn't comfortable driving after dark, even though dark in the winter in South Carolina comes at 5:30. Tuesday and Thursday mornings before work, I dropped groceries at her house because she also didn't like the self-checkout machines and the lines made her anxious. Wednesdays, I called her at exactly 7 p.m. because if I didn't, she'd call me 12 times between 7 and 7:15 wondering where I was. Caleb and his wife Trista lived 40 minutes away in Simpsonville. They had 2 kids, my nephew Brody who was 6 and my niece Harper who was 4. Every other weekend I drove out to watch Brody and Harper so Caleb and Trista could have what Trista called their recharge time. I never questioned it. I just showed up with snacks and a bag of activities and spent 48 hours being a one-woman children's entertainment system. I didn't mind the kids. I loved the kids. What I minded was that it was never once framed as a favor. It was always framed as an assumption. No one ever said, "Would you be willing to?" They said, "We need you Saturday." The difference between those two sentences is the difference between being a person and being a utility. There was also my mother's medical appointments. Twice a month minimum. Her primary care doctor, her cardiologist follow-up, her optometrist, her podiatrist. Regina Lane had elevated everything. Elevated blood pressure, elevated cholesterol, elevated anxiety, and she managed all of it by elevating my workload. I kept a spreadsheet of her medications, her refill dates, her insurance information, and her appointment history. I knew her doctors' names, their nurses' names, their office hours, and their cancellation policies. I knew more about my mother's health than she did. And not once, not a single time, did she ask how I was feeling. I remember the exact moment I started to see it clearly. It was my 34th birthday, a Thursday in March. I woke up and checked my phone the way you do when you're hoping without admitting you're hoping. Nothing. I went to work. Checked again at lunch. Nothing. Drove home. Still nothing. No text, no call, no voicemail. Caleb didn't reach out. Trista sent nothing. My mother, whose number I had called every Wednesday at 7 p.m. for 3 years without missing a single week, did not send so much as a one-word message. At 6:45 that evening my phone rang. I felt something lift in my chest. Maybe she remembered late. Maybe this was it. I answered. She didn't say happy birthday. She said, "Madison, I need you to call Dr. Farrow's office first thing tomorrow and push my appointment back by 30 minutes. I want to stop at the pharmacy first and I can't be rushed." I sat in my car in my own parking lot staring at the steering wheel and I said okay. I hung up. I sat there for 11 minutes. Then I drove to a bakery on Augusta Street and bought myself a single slice of birthday cake, lemon with lavender frosting, and ate it alone in a corner booth while the staff cheerfully sang happy birthday to someone else across the room. That night I opened my laptop. I wasn't looking for anything specific. But I typed into the search bar, Operations Coordinator Jobs Denver, Colorado, and hit enter without really thinking about why. Denver was 1,400 miles away. I'd never been. I didn't know anyone there. But it was 1,400 miles from a parking lot where I just spent my birthday alone, and right then, that was the most appealing thing I'd ever heard. I didn't apply that night. I'm not impulsive. I'm an operations coordinator. I plan. But I did something else instead. Starting the very next morning, I decided to run a quiet, careful experiment. For the next several months I was going to stop waiting for my family to show up for me and start reaching out to them first. Not to coordinate anything. Not to manage anything. Just as a person. Just as Madison. I wanted to know clearly and without any doubt whether they were capable of seeing me that way. I had a feeling I already knew the answer. But I needed the proof. And I was going to document every single attempt. What I found over the months that followed was something I wasn't fully prepared for, even though some part of me had always known. And what I did with what I found changed everything. For me, for my mother, for Caleb, for Trista, and for every person who thought they knew the story of why Madison Lane disappeared. Stay with me. Because it gets so much worse before it gets better. And the package, you're going to want to be here for the package. I want you to understand something before we go any further because it matters for everything that comes after. I was not a doormat by nature. I was not someone who lacked backbone or confidence or self-awareness. I was someone who had been handed a role at 11 years old and told, not in words, but in every possible action and silence, that this was simply who I was. The responsible one. The dependable one. The one you called when things fell apart. The one who showed up so consistently that showing up stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like gravity. You don't question gravity. You just fall. And I had been falling for 23 years. The experiment was about to show me exactly how far down I'd gone. I started the experiment on a Friday morning in March, the day after my birthday. I want to be clear about what the experiment was and what it wasn't. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't a manipulation. It was the simplest possible test. I was going to reach out to my family the way a normal person reaches out to people they love. No logistics. No scheduling. No managing. Just conversation. Just connection. Just Madison trying to be seen as a human being by the people who were supposed to love her most. Kept a notebook. A plain black one I bought at a drugstore on Haywood Road. Every time I sent a message I wrote it down. The date, who I sent it to, what I said, and whether they responded. It was the most depressing journal I've ever kept. The first entry was March 14th. I texted my mother at 10 in the morning. Not about an appointment. Not about a prescription. I sent her a photo of a peach cobbler I had made from scratch the night before, using her own recipe, the one she used to make every summer when I was a kid, the one written on a stained index card tucked into the back of her recipe box. I wrote, "Made your cobbler last night. Turned out perfect. Wish you were here to taste it." I set my phone down and went about my morning. By noon, nothing. By evening, nothing. By the time I went to bed, the message had been read. I could see the timestamp, and my mother had said absolutely nothing back. Not even an emoji. Not even a period. I opened the notebook and wrote, "Read." No response. The second entry was March 17th. I texted Caleb. Not to confirm babysitting, not to ask about Brody's soccer schedule, just a regular human text. "Hey. Haven't talked in a while, just to talk. How are you doing? How's work?" Caleb worked as a site supervisor for a construction company in Simpsonville. He traveled locally, managed crews, came home exhausted. I knew all of this. I asked anyway because I genuinely wanted to know how my brother was doing beyond the logistics of his life. His response came 4 hours later. "All good. Busy. Harper has a cold." That was it. No question back. No "How are you, Madison?" Just a status update like I was his assistant checking in on his household inventory. I wrote it down. 4-word reply. No reciprocation. March 21st. I texted Trista. We had never been close in the way that sisters-in-law can sometimes be close, but we weren't unfriendly either. We had 7 years of shared holidays, shared weekends, shared space. I sent her a message about a home decor idea I'd seen online, something I genuinely thought she'd like since she was always redecorating their living room. "Saw this and thought of you. Isn't this exactly what you were going for in the den?" She opened it. Blue check mark visible immediately. She never replied. Not that day, not the next, not ever. I wrote it down. Ignored. I kept going through April. Through May. I texted my mother a funny story about something that happened at work. No reply. I called Caleb on a Sunday afternoon just to talk. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. I left a message. He never called back. I texted Trista a question about a recipe she had mentioned wanting to try. She replied 3 days later with a 1-word answer and nothing else. I invited my mother to lunch twice. Once to a place I knew she liked on Main Street, once to a spot near her house so she wouldn't have to go far. She declined the first with, "I'm not feeling up to it," and didn't respond to the second at all. I asked Caleb if he wanted to grab dinner, just the 2 of us, the way we used to when we were younger and the world felt smaller. He said maybe and then never followed up. I stopped following up for him. I let the maybe die where it fell. By the end of June I counted the notebook entries. 173 messages, calls and invitations across 3 people. 22 responses total, and of those 22, only 4 could be described as an actual conversation rather than a logistical acknowledgement. 4 real exchanges out of 173 attempts. I sat on my apartment floor with the notebook open in my lap and read through every entry from the beginning. What struck me wasn't the anger. I expected the anger. What I didn't expect was the grief. Reading it all in order, entry by entry, felt like reading the diary of someone who kept knocking on a door that was never going to open, and somehow kept believing that the next knock would be different. I had believed that. For months and years I had kept knocking. The door had never once opened from the other side. In July I applied for the job in Denver. Senior Operations Coordinator at a mid-sized supply chain firm called Bridgepoint Logistics. The salary was 11% higher than what I was making. Full benefits, a structured team, a manager named Deb who had a reputation for developing her people. The application took about 30 minutes. I submitted it on a Tuesday evening after getting home from driving my mother to a pharmacy run she'd added to my schedule without asking. I hit submit and then sat at my kitchen table and ate dinner alone in the quiet, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet felt like something other than loneliness. It felt like the beginning of a decision. The offer came in August. I read the email 3 times before I believed it was real. I called Deb that afternoon and she told me the team was excited, that my background was exactly what they were looking for, that Denver was a great city. I told her I'd never spent time there. She said I was going to love it. I accepted the offer the same day. I gave 4 weeks' notice at my job in Greenville. My boss Terry shook his head slowly and said, "We're going to feel this one for a long time, Madison." 5 words of genuine acknowledgement from a man I'd worked alongside for 4 years. It sat in my chest differently than I expected. I realized it was because I wasn't used to being told I'd be missed. I packed my apartment in the evenings after work. Box by box, shelf by shelf. I sold my couch and my dining table on Facebook Marketplace to a young couple who showed up with a pickup truck and cash and thanked me 3 times before they left. I arranged mail forwarding. I canceled the recurring calendar reminders I had set for my mother's appointments, the ones that had been pinging my phone every other week for 3 years. Each time I deleted one, I felt something loosen in my chest, some knot I'd stopped noticing because I'd carried it so long. There were 2 things I did not do before I left. I did not change my phone number. The same number I'd had since I was 20 years old, listed in my mother's phone, in Caleb's phone, in Trista's phone. If any of them wanted to reach me, the line was open. I wasn't hiding. I was simply stopping the part where I held every door open for everyone else while standing in the cold myself. The second thing I didn't do was say goodbye. Not because I wanted to punish anyone. I didn't say goodbye because I had learned through 173 documented attempts that the conversation would not be about me. It would be about what my leaving meant for them. What they would do without me, for the appointments, for the groceries, for the weekends with Brody and Harper. I didn't have the energy to manage their reaction to my own departure. So I didn't give them the chance. The last night in Greenville, I drove past my mother's house on Pelham Road. The porch light was on. Through the front window I could see the blue flicker of the television. I could have pulled into that driveway. I kept driving. I drove back to my empty apartment, slept on an air mattress I'd kept out for this last night, and set my alarm for 5 in the morning. September 3rd. The moving truck pulled away from the curb at 5:47 a.m. I drove through Greenville in the early dark, past the bakery on Augusta Street where I'd eaten my birthday cake alone, past the pharmacy where I'd picked up my mother's prescriptions more times than I could count, past the highway ramp that pointed west and kept pointing until it became a different life entirely. Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, Kansas, Colorado. 2.5 days of gas stations and drive-thrus and the flat, enormous middle of America spreading out in every direction. Somewhere in Kansas, I rolled the windows all the way down and let the wind hit me full in the face. I didn't feel sad. I felt light. I felt like something that had been pressing on my sternum for 23 years had finally, quietly let go. I arrived in Denver on a Saturday morning. My new apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, with big south-facing windows and a small balcony overlooking a street lined with elm trees. I carried the first box up the stairs, set it on the kitchen floor and stood in the empty apartment and breathed. No phone buzzing. No reminders pinging. No one needing anything from me. I was 34 years old, standing in a room that belonged entirely to me, and the silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something I hadn't felt since I was 10 years old, before the weight landed. I felt like a person instead of a function. What I didn't know yet was what was happening back in Greenville. The silence I'd left behind wasn't peaceful. It was already starting to crack. And in less than 2 months, everything I'd walked away from was going to come looking for me. Not because anyone missed me, but because someone needed a favor. That's when I would find out exactly what I had been worth to them all along. And that's when I would decide what to do about it. The first 2 months in Denver were the quietest of my adult life. And I mean that in the best possible way. I want to paint you a picture of what quiet actually looks like when you've spent 23 years drowning in noise. Not loud noise, not the kind that comes from arguments or chaos, but the constant low hum of other people's needs pressing against you from every direction, every hour of every day. That kind of noise doesn't stop when you walk out of a room. Follows you. Sits on your chest while you sleep. It's the first thing you hear in the morning before you've even opened your eyes. And then one day, if you're lucky, it stops. Not gradually. Just stops. That's what Denver felt like. Like someone had finally, mercifully turned it off. I unpacked slowly. I had no deadline, no one waiting on me to finish, no reason to rush. I arranged my kitchen the way I wanted it, not around anyone else's habits or preferences. I put my coffee maker on the left side of the counter because that's where I reach first in the morning. I hung a print I'd had rolled up in a tube for 2 years because in my Greenville apartment there had never seemed to be a right moment to put something on the wall just for me. I bought a plant, a fiddle leaf fig from a nursery 3 blocks away, and set it in the corner by the south-facing window where the light was best. Small things. Unremarkable things. But every single one of them was mine. No one had an opinion about them. No one needed them to be different. They were just mine. Month 1, I checked my phone out of habit every morning. Nothing from Greenville. I told myself what you tell yourself in those early weeks. That it was still early, that people had their rhythms, that maybe Regina was having one of her quieter spells and would surface soon. I didn't examine that reasoning too closely. I just let it sit. Month 2, I started at Bridgepoint Logistics. Deb was exactly what she'd sounded like on the phone. Direct, organized, the kind of manager who gave you real feedback and then got out of your way. My team had 6 people on it. Within the first week, 2 of them had asked me to grab coffee. Not to talk about work. Just to get to know me. I almost didn't know how to answer. People in my life had stopped asking me things that weren't task-related so long ago that a simple, "Tell me about yourself," felt like being handed something fragile I wasn't sure how to hold. Her name was Joelle. She was 31, originally from Minneapolis, worked as a logistics analyst on my team, and had a laugh that filled whatever room she was standing in. She stopped by my desk on my 4th day and said, "Okay, new person. What do you actually do for fun? And don't say work." I opened my mouth and then closed it, because the honest answer was that I didn't know. I had spent so many years filling every spare hour with someone else's calendar that I had never developed a real answer to that question. I told her I used to like hiking but hadn't done it in years. She said, "Saturday, 7 a.m. I know a trail up near Evergreen. You're coming." It wasn't a question. I showed up. We hiked for 4 hours and talked about everything and nothing, and somewhere around mile 2 I realized I was laughing. Genuinely laughing, without calculating whether it was appropriate or whether someone needed something from me first. That's the thing nobody tells you about leaving a life that was consuming you. The recovery isn't dramatic. It doesn't happen in one big exhale. It happens in small moments you almost miss. It happens when someone asks what music you like and you realize you've actually been thinking about that lately. It happens when you cook dinner for yourself on a Tuesday and it's something you genuinely wanted to eat, not something you made because it was easy to double for someone else. It happens when you sleep through the night without your brain running through tomorrow's list of other people's obligations before you've even opened your eyes. These are the moments. Small, quiet, unremarkable to anyone watching. Everything to the person living them. November came. Thanksgiving. My first one in Denver. I cooked a small meal for myself and Joelle and her roommate, a quiet man named Patrick who taught middle school science and made excellent pie. We ate at Joelle's kitchen table with mismatched chairs and a candle that kept flickering in the draft from the window, and it was the first Thanksgiving in over a decade where I hadn't spent the 4 days prior planning a menu for 12 people, sourcing the right brand of cranberry sauce my mother preferred, coordinating arrival times, managing my brother's expectations about what time dinner would be on the table, and cleaning up alone afterward while everyone else sat in the living room. I washed 3 plates that night. 3. I stood at Joelle's sink and washed 3 plates and felt something in me go genuinely still. Back in Greenville, nobody noticed the chair was empty. I know this because there was no chair. Without me there was no Thanksgiving dinner. Regina Lane did not organize holiday meals. She attended them. Caleb and Trista had never hosted anything more complicated than a backyard birthday party. I was the infrastructure behind every family gathering they'd ever attended, and without the infrastructure, there was simply no gathering. I found this out later through a phone call I'll get to, but I want you to sit with that for a moment. My family did not have Thanksgiving that year. Not because of illness or distance or tragedy. Because I wasn't there to make it happen, and it had never once occurred to any of them to learn how. December arrived and so did my birthday month. March was still 3 months away, but I noticed I was already bracing for it. The old reflex, the anticipatory flinch of someone who has learned not to expect anything and still somehow hopes. I caught myself doing it and I made a deliberate choice. This year I was going to plan something for myself. Not a solo cupcake in a corner booth. Something real. I booked a weekend trip to Santa Fe with Joelle for the first weekend of March. 4 months away, already on the calendar, already mine. It was such a small act. It should not have felt as significant as it did. But I sat with the confirmation email open on my screen for a full minute before I closed it, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt looked forward to, even if I was the only one doing the looking. Then on a Thursday evening in late October, 53 days after I'd driven away from Greenville, my phone lit up. South Carolina area code. Trista. I stared at it through 2 full rings. Trista had not reached out to me in any meaningful way in 7 years. She hadn't responded to my last 4 text messages. She had opened every single one and said nothing. I let it ring a 3rd time. Then I answered because I wanted to hear it. I needed to hear with my own ears what the first contact after 53 days of silence was going to be about. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't say she'd been thinking about me. She said, "Madison, hey, I've been trying to reach you. We need you to come back for Caleb's work banquet next month. It's formal, it's a big deal for him, and we need someone to stay with the kids that weekend. Mom can't do it, her back is out. Can you fly back the 10th? I held the phone against my ear and listened to the sound of my own heartbeat for about 3 seconds. Then I said, "Trista, I don't live in Greenville anymore." The silence on her end was so complete I thought the call had dropped. "What?" she said. "I moved," I said. "2 months ago." Another silence. Then, "And I want you to pay attention to this because it tells you everything you need to know." Her very next sentence was not, "Are you okay?" It was not, "Where did you go?" It was not, "Why didn't you tell us?" Her very next sentence was, "Well, where did you move? Can you still make it back by the 10th? I told her I couldn't. She said okay in a tone that suggested I had personally inconvenienced her and ended the call. No follow-up questions. No concern. No curiosity about where I was or why I'd left or whether I was safe or happy or alive in any real sense of the word. Just the quiet, entitled disappointment of someone who had lost access to a resource. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether I'd made the right decision. Every question I'd carried across 1,400 miles answered itself in a 40-second phone call. Within the hour my phone lit up again. "Regina." I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. "Madison, Trista tells me you moved somewhere. Call me back immediately. I have a cardiology follow-up on the 14th and I need to know who is taking me. Not, are you safe? Not, where are you? Not, why didn't you say goodbye? Just the 14th and who is taking me?" I set the phone face down on my kitchen counter and went back to the dinner I'd been cooking when Trista called. Pasta from scratch, the kind that takes 20 minutes and fills your kitchen with something warm and good. I finished it. I plated it. I sat down at my own table in my own apartment in Denver, Colorado, and I ate every single bite. And then I opened the drawer where I kept the black notebook I had brought from Greenville. The one with 173 entries. I set it on the table beside my plate and I looked at it for a long time. Because something had just shifted. The experiment was over. The results were documented. And now I needed to decide what I was going to do with them. I didn't make the decision about the package overnight. That's the part one want you to understand clearly because I know how this kind of story can sound from the outside. It can sound calculated. It can sound like the whole thing was engineered from the beginning. Like I left Greenville with a plan already tucked into my back pocket, just waiting for the right moment to detonate it. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and more human than that. I sat with the notebook for 3 weeks after Trista's phone call. I carried it from the kitchen table to the nightstand to the top of my bookshelf and back again. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it. I wasn't even sure what I wanted at all. What I knew was this. My mother had left 2 voicemails in the 2 days following Trista's call, and neither of them contained a single question about me. Regina had called to report a problem. A logistical gap. A scheduling emergency that had previously been my job to fill. She was not calling because she missed her daughter. She was calling because the system she'd built on top of her daughter had developed a crack. The voicemails were something I kept coming back to. Not because they were cruel, they weren't, not overtly. They were something worse than cruel. They were completely, utterly indifferent to me as a person. In the first one, she listed her upcoming medical appointments for the next 6 weeks like she was reading from a spreadsheet, then asked me to call Dr. Farrow's office and have them send her records somewhere closer. In the second, she said she'd spoken to Pastor Glenn at her church and that he'd advised her to reach out to me, and then, instead of actually reaching out to me, she asked whether I had set up mail forwarding because some of her subscription magazines were still going to my old address. That was it. That was the extent of maternal concern after her daughter vanished across state lines without a word. Magazine forwarding. I listened to both voicemails 3 times each. I wrote notes in the margins of a notepad. Not because I was building a case. Just because writing things down is how I process them. It always has been. Then my aunt called. My father's older sister, Renata Cruz, who had lived in Asheville for 30 years and had always occupied that particular position in a family. The one who sees everything clearly and says so, gently but without flinching. Renata and I had always been close in the way you can be close to someone you only see twice a year. Warmly, genuinely, without the weight of daily proximity. She called on a Sunday afternoon and said, "I heard from your mother that you moved." I said yes. She said, "Good." Just that. Good. Not where did you go, not why didn't you tell us, just good, like someone crossing an item off a list they'd been worried about for years. I asked her how she'd known to say that. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Madison, I've watched you hold that family together since you were 11 years old. I've watched them take and not once look up to notice what it was costing you. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." I had to set the phone down for a moment after she said that. Not because I was falling apart. Because I hadn't expected to be seen, and being seen, really seen clearly by someone who had been watching for years, does something to you that's hard to describe. It loosens something. It makes room. Renata called again 2 weeks later. She told me that Caleb had reached out to her asking if she knew where I was. And that his first question, like Trista's, like Regina's, had not been, "Is she okay?" It had been, "Do you think she'll come back for Christmas?" I asked Renata what she told him. She said she told him that was the wrong question. That if he wanted to know something worth knowing, he should ask how I was. He hadn't called back. That evening I went to my bookshelf and took down the black notebook. I brought it to the kitchen table. I opened it to the first entry and I read it straight through to the last one, all 173. And when I finished, I closed it and sat in the quiet of my Denver apartment and thought about what I actually wanted to do. Not what would feel satisfying in the short term. Not what would hurt them the most. What I actually wanted for myself in a way that I could stand behind completely. What I decided was this. I was not going to write an angry letter. I was not going to make a phone call full of things I'd stored up for years. I was not going to give anyone the opportunity to argue with me or reframe what I said or make themselves the victim of my honesty. What I was going to do was simpler and more precise than any of that. I was going to print every entry in that notebook, every text, every call attempt, every invitation ignored, every read receipt with no reply. Organize them the way I organized everything at work, cleanly and without commentary, and I was going to mail them to my mother's house. No cover letter full of accusations. No guilt-soaked paragraphs about how much they'd hurt me. Just one single sentence on a white sheet of paper placed on top of everything else. I tried 173 times. Here's the record. I printed everything at the FedEx on Colfax Avenue on a Tuesday evening after work. 146 pages. I organized them into 3 sections using colored divider tabs the way I'd learned to organize project files. 1 section per person, each entry dated, each non-response noted in my own handwriting in the margin. Trista. I did not editorialize. I did not add a single word of interpretation or emotion. The record spoke for itself in a way that no amount of my own words ever could, because the record wasn't mine. Every ignored message, every unopened invitation, every read receipt with silence after it, those belonged to them. I was just returning what was theirs. I found the timing the same way I found everything, by paying attention to what was already in motion. Renata called me on a Saturday morning in late January to tell me that Regina was planning a dinner party. Not a quiet family meal. A production. She'd invited the neighbors, 2 couples from her church, Pastor Glenn and his wife, and Caleb and Trista and the kids. The stated occasion was Harper's 7th birthday. But Renata, who had known Regina Lane for 35 years, heard something else underneath it. She said, "Your mother has been telling people her version of why you left. She's been performing the grieving mother for weeks. She wants a room full of witnesses when she does it properly." I asked Renata what that meant. She said, "She told Barbara Kinsley from the church that you abandoned the family without cause, that she's heartbroken, that she gave you everything and got nothing back. She's rehearsing, Madison. She wants an audience." I looked at the box sitting on my kitchen counter. Already packed, already sealed, the printed pages inside, the single white sheet on top. I had been waiting without knowing what I was waiting for. Now I knew. I calculated the timing the way I calculated everything at work. USPS priority mail from Denver to Greenville, 2 to 3 business days. If I mailed it on a Wednesday, it would arrive Friday at the earliest, Saturday at the latest. The dinner party was Saturday evening. The math was clean. I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. I want to be honest about my own motives here, the way I've tried to be honest about everything else in this story. I wasn't mailing that package to cause a scene. I was mailing it because my mother was about to stand in front of a room full of people and tell them a story that wasn't true, and the only way to answer a false story is with a true one. The package wasn't a weapon. It was a correction. Wednesday morning I drove to the post office on 16th Street before work. The line was short. I handed the box to the clerk, a man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He weighed it, typed in the zip code, told me it would arrive by Saturday. I said that works. He asked if anything inside was fragile. I looked at the box for just a moment. Nothing fragile, I said. Just paper. He printed the label, took my payment and set the box on the conveyor belt behind him. I watched it move until it disappeared around the corner. Then I walked back out into the cold February air, got in my car and drove to work. I sat at my desk. I opened my project files. I answered my emails. I did my job. And somewhere between Denver and Greenville, rolling through the postal system zip code by zip code, was a box full of 146 pages and one sentence. The kind of sentence that doesn't need any explanation. The kind that lands in the middle of a room full of people and changes every conversation that follows. I had spent 23 years being invisible to the people who were supposed to see me best. The package wasn't going to make them love me. I knew that. I wasn't naive enough to think that a stack of printed pages could manufacture something that had never been there. But it was going to make them look. And this time they weren't going to be able to look away. Saturday was 4 days away. And I had absolutely no idea what was about to happen inside my mother's house when that box arrived. But I had a feeling. The same feeling I get at work when a project I've built carefully and quietly is about to deliver exactly what it was designed to deliver. Steady. Certain. And completely finally at peace. Saturday arrived the way significant days always do. Quietly, without ceremony, looking exactly like any other morning. In Denver, I woke up at 7:15, made coffee, stood on my balcony in a fleece jacket and watched the elm trees on the street below catch the early light. I had no way of knowing exactly when the package would be delivered. I had tracked it the night before and the status set out for delivery, Greenville, South Carolina. So it was already there, somewhere in a postal vehicle making its rounds through a neighborhood I knew by heart. I thought about that for a moment. The box sitting in a truck on Pelham Road, 2 blocks from my mother's house, completely ordinary from the outside, nothing to indicate what was inside. Just a cardboard box with a Denver return address. I finished my coffee. I went inside. I was not anxious. That surprised me a little. But the thing about making a decision carefully and taking weeks to sit with it before you act. The thing about that is by the time you've actually done it, you've already made your peace with what comes next. I didn't know the details of that Saturday in Greenville until later. Renata pieced most of it together for me over 2 phone calls the following week, filling in what she'd heard with the careful, precise delivery of someone who understood exactly how much I needed the full picture. So let me tell you what happened inside my mother's house that evening, in the order that it happened, as close to the truth as I've been able to reconstruct it. The package arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon, according to the delivery confirmation I checked that evening. The party was scheduled for 6. Regina had been in the kitchen since noon, notable in itself because my mother had not cooked seriously since I was a teenager. She had attempted a baked ziti from a recipe she'd printed off the internet. By all accounts it was serviceable, though apparently the edges were overcooked because nobody had reminded her to cover it with foil for the first 40 minutes. Small things. The kind of things I had always simply known without being asked. The box was placed on the front porch by the carrier. Regina found it when she stepped outside to check whether the potted mums she'd arranged by the door looked presentable. She carried it inside and set it on the entryway table without opening it, because she was in the middle of something and the return address didn't have a name, just a Denver Street address, and she assumed it was something she'd ordered online and forgotten about. By 6 o'clock the house was full. Pastor Glenn and his wife Donna arrived first and settled into the living room with the quiet ease of people who are comfortable wherever they go. The neighbors Frank and Dolores Marsh from 2 doors down came next. Then the Hendersons from church, a couple in their late 60s who had known Regina for over 20 years. Caleb and Trista arrived last with Brody and Harper, Harper in a birthday dress slightly too big for her and Brody already asking when the food would be ready. The house was warm in the way houses get when they're full of people performing normalcy without quite achieving it. Because underneath everything, there was a tension everyone in that family felt and nobody named, the empty space where Madison had always been. I had planned every gathering held in that house for the better part of a decade. My absence wasn't just personal, it was structural. Things were off in ways people couldn't articulate. The timing was wrong. The appetizers were store-bought. The flowers in the vase were the wrong kind, the kind you grab at a grocery checkout rather than the kind you actually choose. Nobody notices those contributions until they're gone. Regina made her move before dinner. She tapped her wine glass with a fingernail, the same way she'd done at every family gathering I could remember, and the room settled. And then she delivered the speech she had clearly been rehearsing for weeks. She talked about sacrifice. About raising her children alone after their father left. About giving everything she had and asking so little in return. And then she arrived at me, the older daughter who had vanished without explanation, who had abandoned the people who loved her. Her voice cracked in exactly the right places. The Hendersons exchanged a look of sympathy. Dolores Marsh reached over and briefly touched Regina's arm. The performance was landing. Right up until Frank Marsh turned toward the entryway table and said, "Regina, there's a package there with a Denver return address. Were you expecting something from Denver?" The room shifted. Caleb brought the box to the dining table. Regina opened it herself. She lifted the flaps, saw the folder, saw the single white sheet on top, and read it aloud before she understood what she was holding. "I tried 173 times. Here's the record." She flipped the page over. Blank on the back. She opened the first tab. Her name at the top. The first entry dated March 14th. A screenshot of a text message, a photo of a peach cobbler, a note that said "Wish you were here," and next to it in my handwriting the notation. Read. No response. She turned the page. Another entry. Another notation. Another silence documented in ink. Her hand began to shake. Not dramatically. Just the small, involuntary tremor of someone encountering something they cannot dismiss. Caleb pulled the second tab, his section. He read the first entry. Then the second. He set the folder down and didn't pick it up again. Trista looked at her section without touching it, like she already knew what was there and was calculating the cost of confirming it. Pastor Glenn was the first to speak. He said, simply and without accusation, that it appeared Madison had been trying very hard to stay connected to her family. That sentence was all it took. Frank Marsh said quietly that he'd watched me mow Regina's lawn every Saturday for 3 summers without once being thanked. Dolores said she remembered the year I'd managed my mother's entire recovery after a minor knee procedure, 3 physical therapy trips a week for 6 weeks, and had always wondered whether I'd been asked or simply expected. The guests were not angry. They were something quieter and more devastating than angry. They were no longer willing to pretend they hadn't seen what they'd always seen. And one by one, with the unmistakable energy of people who have somewhere else to be, they left. By 8 o'clock the house was empty except for family. Regina turned on Caleb first. If his sister had been so unhappy, why hadn't he noticed? Caleb turned it back. She was their mother, wasn't it her job? Trista said it was nobody's fault, which was the most dishonest thing said all evening, and Caleb told her so in a voice that was quiet and certain. He had read his section of the folder. He had seen every text I sent, every invitation extended, every check-in, every attempt made and met with nothing. He had seen, in the absence of his own responses, exactly what kind of brother he had been. And he had no defense for it. Not one that could hold. In Denver, I was at Joelle's apartment. My phone buzzed several times and I turned it face down. Later, at home, I listened to the voicemails. Regina first, sharp, wounded, the old register, "How could you do this in my own home?" Then Caleb. And Caleb's was different. His voice was careful and low, the voice of a man who had chosen every word before he spoke it. He said he'd read everything in the folder. He said he didn't have an excuse. He said he was sorry, and he said it without a single qualifier, without a but, without redirecting toward anyone else's fault. Just, "I'm sorry. I played it twice. I didn't call back that night. Some things need room before you know what to do with them. Renata sent me a text before I turned the light off. 3 words. You did right." I set the phone on my nightstand and lay in the dark listening to the city outside my window. Somewhere in Greenville, a dinner party had just ended in a way no one had anticipated. A room full of people had seen something true that they couldn't unsee. A family had fractured not because I had done anything to them, but because they had finally been made to look at what they had done. And I felt none of the things people might expect. Not vindicated. Not triumphant. Not sad. I felt clean. The way a room feels when you open every window after years of keeping them shut and let the air finally fully move through it. I am Madison Lane. I am 35 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado in an apartment with south-facing windows and a fiddle leaf fig that is doing extremely well, and a calendar that has my name on every single entry. I was not the villain of this story, though I know some people will decide I was. I was a person who tried 173 times to be seen by her own family, documented every attempt with the same discipline she brought to everything in her life, and then quietly, carefully, without malice or performance, showed them the record they had made together. If you are the person in your family who holds everything together, who manages the calendars and drives the appointments and fills every silence and plans every gathering and never once gets asked how you are, I need you to hear this. You are not a service. You are not a system. You are a person. And the people who can't tell the difference are not your responsibility to fix. Set the box down. Mail it if you have to. And then go build something that belongs to you. That's my story. And I hope it found the right person today. 8 months. That's the time jump. Not a year, not 2, 8 months, because that's exactly how long it took for the truth to finish settling into all the cracks it had opened, for the dust to clear enough that everyone involved, including me, could finally see the shape of what was left. 8 months is long enough for people to stop reacting and start reckoning. Long enough for the performance to run out of an audience. Long enough for a few of them to decide, quietly and without announcement, that they wanted to do something different. I want to tell you what that looks like from where I'm standing. Not because it's a tidy resolution, it isn't. Not because everyone learned their lesson and the family reunited over a warm meal with tears and apologies. That didn't happen either. What happened was messier and more real than that. And I think you've earned the real version. Denver in October is something I wasn't prepared for when I first moved here. Coming from South Carolina, where fall is a suggestion more than a season, the Rockies in October feel like stepping into a painting someone made when they were trying to capture what the word crisp actually means. The aspens go gold on the mountain slopes. The air has a clarity that makes everything look slightly more defined than it did the day before. I've been hiking on weekends now with more intention than I had in those early months, when Joelle was still essentially dragging me up trails by the sheer force of her enthusiasm. Now I go because I want to. Now I plan the routes myself and look forward to them the way I used to look forward to nothing. I was promoted in September. Full program manager, overseeing 3 project streams and a team of 11 people. Deb called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon and slid the offer letter across the desk and said, "I want to make sure you know this is based entirely on what you've built here. You earn the room every single day." I signed the letter and then sat in my car in the parking garage for 4 minutes just breathing. Because that sentence, "you earn the room," was the kind of thing I had been doing my entire life without anyone ever saying it back to me. Deb didn't know the history behind why those words landed the way they did. He just meant them. That was enough. Now let me tell you about the people I left behind. Their stories didn't stop when mine started getting better. That's the part people sometimes forget. The aftermath of a reckoning doesn't pause while you're busy healing. It keeps moving. And what it moved toward in the 8 months since that dinner party was something nobody in that house on Pelham Road could have predicted. Regina Lane went to therapy. I want to say that clearly and without sarcasm because it matters and because it wasn't easy for her. She started seeing a therapist named Dr. Amara Webb in April, a woman who specializes in family systems and who apparently does not allow Regina to make herself the center of every narrative, which must have been a significant adjustment. I know this because Regina told me herself. She called me in late June on a Sunday evening and the call lasted 47 minutes. She didn't open with a request. She didn't have an agenda. She talked about her own childhood for the first time in front of me, about her own mother who had been cold and withholding, and about how she had spent her whole adult life trying to fill that emptiness with the validation of other people without ever noticing she was asking her children to provide it. She didn't frame it as an excuse. She delivered it the way someone talks when they've finally found the name for something they've been carrying for 60 years without understanding it. At the end she said, "I don't expect forgiveness right now. I just wanted you to know I'm working on it. I told her I heard her. I meant it. I'm not ready to rebuild what we had. Mostly because what we had wasn't worth rebuilding. But something new might be possible. That's more than I would have said 8 months ago. Caleb took longer, and that surprised me. His voicemail had been the most direct, the most unqualified. But accountability in a moment of shock and accountability as a sustained daily practice are two very different muscles. And Caleb had spent his whole life exercising neither. He called twice in the weeks after the dinner party, and both times the conversation was genuine but short. Apology offered, acknowledged, edges of something real circled without landing. Then in July he did something unexpected. He drove to Asheville to have dinner with Renata. Alone, without Trista, without the kids. Just Caleb and our aunt across from each other in her kitchen for 3 hours. Renata told me afterward that he spent the first hour in quiet defense. Not aggressive, just the reflexive self-protection of someone not quite ready. And then somewhere in the second hour he went still. He sat there for a moment and then said, "She checked in on me every week for years and I don't think I ever once asked how she was doing." Renata told him that was correct and that knowing it was step one. We've been texting since August. Real texts, not logistics. He sent me a photo last week of a trail near Simpsonville he'd hiked with Brody, with a note that just said, "Thought you'd like this one." I sent back a photo of a trail I'd done near Evergreen. That's where we are. Quiet. Early. Trista is the most complicated piece and I want to be honest about that rather than smooth it over. She has not apologized directly. She's acknowledged, in a sideways and qualified way routed through Caleb, that things were not handled well. But a sideways acknowledgement delivered by someone else is not an apology and I won't call it one. What I do know is that Trista has been managing her household without me for 8 months. The school pickups, the pediatric appointments, the grocery runs, the birthday parties. All of it every week alone. Caleb told me she said once, quietly, that she hadn't understood how much I had been doing until she was the one doing it. That's not nothing. It's not enough, not yet. But it's a beginning, and I'm willing to let it be a beginning without forcing it into something it isn't ready to become. The people I want to tell you about the most are Brody and Harper. Because they were never part of what went wrong. They have always been the part of leaving that cost me the most. Brody is 7 now. Harper just turned 7 herself. The birthday that gave occasion to the dinner party that changed everything, which means her birthday now carries a significance in this family's history that she won't understand for many years. I video called them in August. Caleb set it up. Harper answered holding a stuffed elephant and immediately launched into a detailed account of something involving a substitute teacher, a broken projector and the class hamster, none of which was connected to anything I'd asked and all of which was perfect. Brody was more careful, the way 7-year-olds can be when they sense something without having the words for it. After a few minutes he looked directly at the camera and asked, "Madison, are you coming back?" I told him I wasn't coming back to Greenville to live, but that I wasn't gone from his life. He thought about that. Then he asked if Denver had mountains. I told him it had a lot of them. He said he wanted to see them someday. I said maybe someday he would. I meant it completely. There is one more thing and it's the smallest thing and somehow the most significant. In September, 6 weeks after the promotion, I flew to Santa Fe for a long weekend alone. Joel had a family commitment and couldn't make it, so I went by myself. I booked a small hotel near the plaza, walked everywhere, ate green chili on everything, spent 2 afternoons in galleries, and on Friday evening sat at a restaurant courtyard eating dinner alone at a table set for 1, with a glass of wine and a book I'd meant to read for 2 years. A woman at the table beside me, also traveling alone, caught my eye and raised her glass just slightly. A small, wordless acknowledgement between 2 people who had both chosen exactly where they were. I raced mine back. I thought about a parking lot in Greenville where I once ate birthday cake alone in my car. Windows up, engine running, going nowhere. The same aloneness, completely transformed. The difference between those 2 moments had nothing to do with the circumstances and everything to do with who was doing the choosing. 8 months looks like this. A program manager title on a new business card. A Saturday trail mapped the night before because I wanted to, not because someone needed me somewhere else. A video call with a 7-year-old and her elephant. A brother learning slowly and imperfectly to show up. A mother sitting with a therapist in Greenville doing the hardest thing she's attempted in decades. And me, Madison Lane, 35 years old, raising a glass of wine to a stranger across a courtyard in Santa Fe, whole and unbothered and entirely finally my own. That's the ending. Not a resolution. Not a reunion. Just the truth lived quietly forward. And after 23 years of everything else, the truth lived on my own terms is more than I ever thought to ask for. Turns out it was the only thing I ever actually needed. I said at the beginning of this story that I left without a word to anyone. And I've been asked in the months since whether I regret that. Whether I wish I had handled it differently. The honest answer is no. Not because I'm certain I did everything right. I'm not. But because I spent 5 months trying to have that conversation through text messages and phone calls and invitations, and every single one of them was met with silence. The conversation I needed was never going to happen inside a system that needed me too much to ever really hear me. Sometimes the only way to be understood is to leave the room first. And then when you've built something solid enough to stand on, send back the record and let the silence explain itself. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.